European Union leaders gathered in Brussels and issued a call for a moratorium on strikes against energy and water facilities in the Middle East. That is the fact at the center of this story, a moratorium on attacks against the systems that keep lights on, fuel moving, and water flowing for civilians across a region already under immense strain. And the reason that call came now at this particular summit was the escalating Iran war, along with rising concern over civilian infrastructure and maritime traffic. But before we get to what that appeal may signal more broadly, there is a more immediate question sitting underneath it. Why did EU leaders choose to single out energy and water facilities at all? And why did they do so in the middle of a summit in Brussels? Imagine the scene for a moment. Leaders from across the European Union meeting together, confronting a regional conflict tied to Iran that had grown serious enough to pull basic infrastructure into the center of the conversation. Not just military positions, not just borders, not just diplomacy in the abstract, energy, water, shipping lanes. That framing matters because it tells you where the alarm was focused. Reuters reported that the appeal from EU leaders was directed at attacks against energy and water facilities in the Middle East. Those are not marginal systems. Those are the kinds of facilities that shape daily life at the most fundamental level. They are the backbone of civilian continuity. They are what stand between ordinary disruption and something much more severe. And so the language of a moratorium lands with unusual weight. Not condemnation in a general sense, not a broad statement of concern detached from events. A moratorium, a call to stop this category of strikes, to pause attacks on the facilities that sustain human life and regional stability. Think about that for a second. Because when leaders narrow their message that specifically, they are telling you where they believe the danger is concentrating. This detail becomes critical in a moment. The summit took place in Brussels. Reuters said the appeal came in response to the escalating Iran war and the risk to civilian infrastructure and maritime traffic. That means the concern was not confined to damage on land. It was also about movement, trade, transit, the passage of ships through one of the most sensitive maritime corridors in the world. And there, the story begins to widen. On one side, you have the regional conflict connected to Iran. On the other, you have the systems that move energy and commerce through the Middle East and beyond. When EU leaders linked strikes on infrastructure to risk for maritime traffic, they were not describing two separate problems. They were naming one increasingly interconnected crisis. Here is how that breaks down. Energy facilities are not isolated assets. Water facilities are not isolated assets. Maritime traffic is not isolated from what happens on shore. In a region where infrastructure, shipping, and security are tightly bound together, pressure on one can ripple into the others. Reuters reported that EU leaders were addressing exactly that mix of risk as the Iran war escalated. So the statement from Brussels was doing more than expressing worry. It was identifying a threshold. The threshold where war reaches beyond immediate battle lines and begins to endanger the systems civilians rely on and the routes global shipping depends on. Sometimes the quietest threats travel the farthest. That is the kind of line that hangs in the air because this story is, in part, about things that are easy to treat as background until they are suddenly not background at all. Water systems, energy networks, shipping routes. These are usually the supports beneath the headline. Here they became the headline. And once that happens, the stakes change. Reuters also reported that EU leaders backed stronger naval deployments tied to shipping security near the Strait of Hormuz. Hold that thought for a moment, because that is where this story starts to sharpen. The public appeal for a moratorium on attacks against infrastructure came alongside support for a more robust naval posture connected to maritime protection. One side of the response was a call for restraint. The other was reinforcement. That contrast is not accidental. A moratorium suggests an effort to prevent further escalation around critical facilities. Stronger naval deployments suggest preparation for danger already viewed as serious enough to require a security response. Put those together, and you get a picture of how EU leaders were reading the moment in Brussels. Not as a distant regional dispute, but as a conflict whose effects could radiate through civilian systems and international shipping channels at the same time. And the place named in that second Reuters detail matters enormously: the Strait of Hormuz. Picture this in your mind: a narrow maritime passage carrying outsized strategic importance, a place where shipping security becomes more than a technical phrase, a place where concern about maritime traffic is inseparable from concern about energy movement, regional stability, and the possibility that escalation could spread consequences far beyond any one battlefield. Reuters said EU leaders backed stronger naval deployments tied to shipping security near that strait. Not somewhere vague, not a generic maritime zone, near the Strait of Hormuz. The precision of that location tells you this was not theoretical. It also tells you that the appeal for a moratorium on attacks against energy and water facilities was being made against a backdrop of concrete security concern. EU leaders were not talking only about what had already happened. They were also reacting to the risk of what might happen next if the trajectory continued. And that creates a central tension in this story. If the concern is serious enough to justify stronger naval deployments near the Strait of Hormuz, what does that say about how exposed energy and water facilities may already be in the broader regional conflict connected to Iran? Why did the summit produce both an appeal for restraint and support for heightened maritime security in the same update? That dual response is the thread to follow. Reuters described the update as involving EU member states and the wider regional conflict connected to Iran. So this was not a single country declaration floating on its own. It came out of a summit setting through EU leaders with reference to both member states and a wider conflict environment. In other words, the story sits at the intersection of collective European political messaging and a rapidly worsening regional security situation. And the language chosen by Reuters is worth listening to carefully. Escalating Iran war, risk to civilian infrastructure, risk to maritime traffic, stronger naval deployments, shipping security near the Strait of Hormuz, wider regional conflict connected to Iran. Each piece adds pressure to the next. The war is escalating, infrastructure is at risk, maritime traffic is at risk, naval security is being strengthened. The regional conflict is widening in relevance, if not in geography, then certainly in consequence. There is no wasted motion in that sequence. It also means the story is not just about what EU leaders said. It is about what their statement reveals regarding the shape of the danger they were trying to address. Energy and water facilities became specific objects of protection in their appeal. Shipping security near a named maritime choke point became specific grounds for stronger deployments. This is a report built around the protection of systems that people depend on every day, even when those systems are usually invisible in diplomatic language. I mean, that is a striking place for a summit message to land. Because once the discussion centers on water and energy infrastructure, the human stakes become impossible to push to the margins. And once shipping security near the Strait of Hormuz enters the same frame, the regional stakes become impossible to isolate. So the opening section of this story leaves us with a hard question. Was this Brussels appeal simply an attempt to contain danger already spilling outward from the escalating Iran war? Or was it also an acknowledgement that the conflict had entered a phase where civilian infrastructure and maritime security were becoming inseparable parts of the same crisis? That question matters, because what happened next makes sense of everything. Before we move forward, take a moment to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to support independent, fact-driven reporting. The immediate payoff is this. The same EU leaders who called for a moratorium on strikes against energy and water facilities in the Middle East also backed stronger naval deployments tied to shipping security near the Strait of Hormuz. That is not a contradiction. It is the core of the story. One message was directed at what should stop, the other was directed at what had to be protected. And when those two moves appear together in the same Reuters update, they tell you something precise about the way this summit in Brussels was responding to the escalating Iran war and the wider regional conflict connected to Iran. Let me walk you through what happened. Reuters reported that EU leaders made their appeal during a summit in Brussels. The appeal focused on attacks against energy and water facilities in the Middle East. The reason given was the escalating Iran war and the risk to civilian infrastructure and maritime traffic. Then came the second part of the report. EU leaders backed stronger naval deployments tied to shipping security near the Strait of Hormuz. So there are really two layers operating at once here. The first is civilian vulnerability, the second is maritime exposure, and the line between them is thinner than it may sound at first. Energy facilities are not simply industrial sites. In the context of this Reuters report, they were treated as part of the civilian infrastructure at risk. Water facilities, even more directly, sit inside that category of civilian dependence. That means the summit language in Brussels was not abstract diplomacy floating above events. It was tied to systems that affect ordinary life in immediate ways. Then the report pivots to maritime traffic. That pivot is the hinge of the entire narrative. Because as soon as Reuters places maritime traffic alongside energy and water facilities in the same sentence of concern, the geography of the story changes. We are no longer dealing only with what can be struck on land. We are dealing with movement through the region, passage through vulnerable waters, security near one of the most strategically significant waterways named in the update, the Strait of Hormuz. Think about the sequence here for a moment. An escalating war connected to Iran, risks to civilian infrastructure, risks to maritime traffic, a call for a moratorium on attacks against key facilities, support for stronger naval deployments tied to shipping security. The order matters because it shows how one concern appears to lead directly into the next. The number in this story is not a casualty figure or a budget line. It is the number 2. Two kinds of systems: infrastructure on land and shipping at sea. Two kinds of response: an appeal for restraint and a decision to back stronger naval deployments. Two overlapping areas of concern, the Middle East broadly and the Strait of Hormuz specifically. And once you hear it that way, the Reuters report starts to sound less like a collection of separate facts and more like a single coordinated reading of danger. Power without preparation is just performance. That line lands here because the summit response, as described by Reuters, was not only rhetorical. The call for a moratorium belongs to the language of restraint. The backing of stronger naval deployments belongs to the language of preparedness. And the report gives you both in one movement. That is the unexpected detail at the center of this section. A summit communique could have stayed at the level of concern. It could have condemned violence in broad terms. It could have avoided naming systems like water and energy or locations like the Strait of Hormuz. But Reuters reported something more specific than that. Specific facilities, specific risks, specific maritime security measures. Specificity is what gives this story its shape, and there is a reason that matters. General concern can be interpreted 100 ways, but when leaders identify energy and water facilities and then connect those concerns to stronger naval deployments near the Strait of Hormuz, they are identifying where vulnerability is concentrated and where they believe protection is now necessary. That does not expand the facts. It follows the internal logic of the report itself. Here is the contrast setup. One side brought an appeal: stop the strikes against energy and water facilities. The other brought a security response: strengthen naval deployments tied to shipping security near the Strait of Hormuz. The appeal addresses conduct. The deployments address consequence. That distinction becomes critical in a moment. Because Reuters also said the update involved EU member states and the wider regional conflict connected to Iran. So the summit response was being framed not merely as concern over a local disruption, but as part of a collective European response to a regional conflict with broader implications. Again, that wording is doing a lot of work. EU member states, wider regional conflict connected to Iran. This was a regional crisis being discussed through a European institutional lens. And what that lens appears to have picked up, according to Reuters, is the degree to which civilian systems and maritime security had entered the same field of concern. That is where the deepest narrative continuation lives, not in any one sentence by itself, but in the structure of what was grouped together in the report. Water, energy, maritime traffic, naval deployments, the Strait of Hormuz. That is not random grouping. Picture this in your mind: a summit room in Brussels where the discussion is not confined to one battlefield or one immediate incident, but extends outward to the systems that support daily life and commercial movement. The report does not need to say more than that to convey the seriousness of the moment. The nouns do the work. And then there is the phrase shipping security. It sounds procedural, almost dry, but placed next to stronger naval deployments near the Strait of Hormuz, it becomes one of the most consequential phrases in the update. Shipping security means the movement of vessels had become serious enough to warrant backing a stronger presence. Reuters does not embellish that. It simply reports it. The force of it comes from the pairing of the phrase with the place, near the Strait of Hormuz. That specificity narrows the field of concern and raises the level of urgency at the same time. Because once the report gives you that location, the idea of maritime traffic risk is no longer floating in the abstract. It is attached to a defined corridor. And once the report ties stronger naval deployments to that corridor, the summit's call for a moratorium on strikes against energy and water facilities starts to read as part of a broader effort to slow a spiral that was touching both essential infrastructure and critical shipping routes. This is where the story's most important fact comes into focus. Not a new fact, but the one that carries the most weight when all the others are set around it. EU leaders did not respond to the escalating Iran war with only words of concern. Reuters reported that they also backed stronger naval deployments tied to shipping security near the Strait of Hormuz. That is the hinge. Because it means the summit response contained both a request for restraint and support for a security posture. In plain terms, stop attacks on energy and water facilities, and at the same time, strengthen protection for shipping near a key maritime choke point. The report presents those two moves side by side. That pairing is the architecture of the update. And once that architecture is clear, another question rises. What does it tell us that the Reuters report placed energy and water facilities at the center of the appeal rather than treating them as secondary casualties of war? Hold that thought. It tells us those facilities were central enough to be named, central enough to be separated out, central enough for EU leaders at a summit in Brussels to call specifically for a moratorium on strikes against them, not just concern over damage in general, not just a warning about instability in broad terms, a direct appeal tied to two categories of infrastructure. That level of precision is not decorative. And in the same report, maritime traffic is treated with similar seriousness, not merely as an economic aftereffect, as a risk in its own right. One important enough for EU leaders to back stronger naval deployments linked to shipping security near the Strait of Hormuz. So the central event here is not just a statement, it is a dual framing of the crisis. Land-based infrastructure with civilian consequence. Sea-based traffic with regional and international consequence. The Reuters report does not spell that out in analytical language, but the facts it includes line up that way with notable clarity, and that is why this section builds where it does. The deepest point in the narrative is not hidden. It is sitting in plain view inside the pairing of the summit's two responses. The smallest ruptures can carry the widest reach. That quote works here because the update is about systems that seem stable right up until they are not. Water systems, energy systems, shipping routes. They are the quiet architecture of ordinary continuity. Reuters reported EU leaders responding at the exact point where those systems appeared endangered by the escalating Iran war and the wider regional conflict connected to Iran. And now we come to the tension that has to carry us into the final section. If Brussels was already calling for a moratorium on attacks against energy and water facilities and backing stronger naval deployments tied to shipping security near the Strait of Hormuz, then the unresolved question is no longer what the summit was worried about. That much is clear. The unresolved question is what this combination of restraint and reinforcement was meant to prevent before the risks to civilian infrastructure and maritime traffic became even harder to contain. By the time the Brussels summit produced this appeal, the shape of the warning was already clear. European Union leaders called for a moratorium on strikes against energy and water facilities in the Middle East. Reuters reported that the appeal came in response to the escalating Iran war and the risk to civilian infrastructure and maritime traffic. And alongside that appeal, Reuters said EU leaders backed stronger naval deployments tied to shipping security near the Strait of Hormuz. That is the resolution of the central tension. The summit response was built around prevention and protection at the same time. Prevention in the call to halt attacks against essential facilities, protection in the backing of stronger naval deployments connected to shipping security. The facts do not need embellishment. They arrive already carrying their own gravity, and that is where the broader meaning settles. Not broader in the sense of adding context beyond the report, broader in the sense of understanding what the report itself reveals. When leaders single out energy and water facilities during a summit in Brussels, they are not speaking only about military escalation in the abstract. They are speaking about the systems underneath daily life. When they connect that concern to maritime traffic and then support stronger naval deployments near the Strait of Hormuz, they are speaking about movement, access, and the security of passage in a conflict environment tied to Iran. The story closes where it began, with infrastructure. But now it sounds different. At the beginning, the striking fact was that EU leaders had called for a moratorium on attacks against energy and water facilities in the Middle East. By the end, that call sits inside a larger structure. Reuters reported not just an appeal, but an appeal joined to a security measure, not just concern about war, but concern about what war was putting at risk: civilian infrastructure, maritime traffic, shipping security near a named choke point. Think about that for a moment. This was a summit response that drew a line around the foundations of continuity: water, energy, maritime passage. Those are not side notes. Those are conditions of ordinary life and regional stability. Reuters did not need to argue that point explicitly. The categories themselves tell the story, and so the closing section is not about a twist, it is about clarity. The Reuters update involved EU member states and the wider regional conflict connected to Iran. That phrase matters now in a different way than it did earlier. Earlier, it helped establish scope. Here it helps explain why the language of the summit joined local infrastructure concerns to maritime security near the Strait of Hormuz. The report frames the crisis as regional. The response accordingly touches both onshore systems and sea-based routes. That is the connection that now fully resolves. One cannot be understood without the other in this report. The risk to energy and water facilities exists within the same conflict environment as the risk to maritime traffic. The support for stronger naval deployment sits in the same update as the call for restraint against attacks on essential infrastructure. One addresses what must not be hit, the other addresses what must be safeguarded. Here is how that lands at human scale. Water facilities are about whether water flows. Energy facilities are about whether power and fuel systems continue functioning. Maritime traffic is about whether movement through the region remains secure. When Reuters places those three concerns in the same summit report, the consequence is immediate. The language of war is no longer confined to front lines. It reaches the systems civilians depend on and the corridors vessels move through. That is the factual meaning carried by the structure of the report itself. The things people rely on most are often the least visible. That line belongs here because the entire story turns on systems that are often treated as background until a crisis forces them into the center. Water infrastructure is usually discussed only when it fails. Energy facilities are often noticed most when they are threatened. Maritime traffic becomes a headline when security around it starts to tighten. In this Reuters report, all three move to the foreground at once. And that is why the Brussels summit response feels so specific. It is not framed as an all-purpose declaration. It is built around identified targets of concern and an identified area of maritime focus: the Middle East, energy and water facilities, the Strait of Hormuz, shipping security. Those details do not sprawl, they lock together. Imagine the sequence one more time now from end to beginning. Stronger naval deployments tied to shipping security near the Strait of Hormuz, risk to maritime traffic, risk to civilian infrastructure, an escalating Iran war, a call for a moratorium on strikes against energy and water facilities in the Middle East. When you reverse the order like that, you can hear the internal logic of the response. The summit did not arrive at its language by accident. Reuters presented a chain of concern that moves from conflict to infrastructure risk to maritime risk to security response. That sequence is what gives the report its coherence. And it also brings us back to the opening shock with a more complete understanding of why that first fact mattered so much. A moratorium on strikes against energy and water facilities is not just notable because of the words themselves. It is notable because of the conditions Reuters said produced that appeal: an escalating Iran war, a wider regional conflict connected to Iran, and danger reaching into both civilian infrastructure and maritime traffic. The appeal sounds different once you know it arrived beside backing for stronger naval deployments near the Strait of Hormuz, because then it becomes unmistakably a warning as well as a request. Not a warning delivered through rhetoric alone, but through alignment. The facts in the report align in a way that tells you exactly where the pressure was being felt: essential systems on land, vulnerable shipping routes at sea, European leaders responding collectively in Brussels. No extra drama is needed. In fact, what gives this story its force is how little ornament it requires. Reuters reported the summit, the appeal, the reason, and the related security backing. The facts are spare, but they are arranged around some of the most basic structures of modern continuity: water, energy, maritime traffic. That is why they carry the weight they do. You know, there is a quiet symmetry in the way the report closes in around necessity. Water is necessary, energy is necessary. Secure passage for shipping near the Strait of Hormuz was necessary enough, in Reuters' account, for EU leaders to back stronger naval deployments tied to that security. And once necessity enters the frame, the emotional force of the story changes. Not because the report editorializes, it does not, but because necessity always feels closer than strategy. You can hear it, you can measure it, you can imagine its interruption. Picture this in your mind, not maps, not military diagrams, not summit tables, just the lived meaning of the words the report chose. Facilities that supply energy, facilities that provide water, maritime traffic moving through a narrow, strategically important corridor. Leaders gathered in Brussels responding to a war tied to Iran by calling for a pause in attacks on the first two and backing stronger protection for the third. That is the full arc. The opening shock was the call for a moratorium. The deep middle was the pairing of that appeal with stronger naval deployments tied to shipping security near the Strait of Hormuz. And the ending truth is that both parts belong to the same warning. The escalating Iran war had raised concern not only about conflict itself, but about the systems that sustain civilian life and regional movement. That is what the Reuters report says. And when a story narrows all the way down to water, energy, and passage, it leaves you with something more durable than a passing headline. It leaves you with a clear sense of what was being protected, what was being threatened, and why EU leaders chose that moment in Brussels to speak in exactly those terms. Sometimes the most basic things carry the greatest weight.